This is the part of session 3 that I didn't get round to doing with you. So if you refer to your handout from session 3, you'll have all these slides on it from the PowerPoint, and it's looking through the figures linked with assessments. So we're going to, in the next few minutes, look at from the raw score through standardised scores, composites, your descriptors, confidence intervals and percentiles. Starting with the raw score, don't worry about reporting that on your assessment because it means very little to the reader. We use our raw score obviously to get our scaled or standardised score. Now, largely, subtests have a scaled score. I'll go through this in a moment again. And composite scores are standardised. We want to, throughout your report, always refer to the standardised score where the mean is 100. But I will talk about that again in a moment. Largely, they're described as scaled if the mean is 10 and standardised if the mean is 100. You get the occasional assessment, for some reason, calling a standardised score a scaled score, for example, with the TOWRY. But with that, you're just going to have to use common sense. If the numbers are low, between 0 and 20, it's going to be scaled. If they're higher, between, I don't know, say 60 to 120, then it's standardised. I'm going to show you that again in a moment anyway. So, you have got this chart, and it's a reminder about scaled scores and standardised scores or standard scores. So again, 10 being 100, and that's your mean. You'll see that through the standardised scores, they go up by increments of 5. That's important later. But largely, whenever you get a scale score for a subtest, use your chart. So if they've scored 6, you report it as 80. You have this as a reminder of that on your PowerPoint handouts. When you report your scaled scores and standardised scores in your charts, some of them you can add together to make a composite. So these are the assessments, these are examples of assessments where you've got subtests that also give a composite score. Not all assessments do. So for example, CTOP, you've got, I'll reach over here, elision, blending words and phoneme isolation make up your phonological awareness composite, and that's the same in other assessments as well. The composite score is seen as being more reliable than a subtest score. Now, sometimes you get big differences between your subtest scores. You can still get a composite. The RIT is an exception. We'll come to that later. I just want to show an example. This is the CTOP, and you can see these are scaled scores because they're low. You've got your mean of 10. And there's a big difference between the elision, which is 6, which would be standardised score 80, and the blending words, which is scale score 11, which would be standardised score 105. That's a big difference between 80 to 105. However, you can still, you can still use them to get a sum of scale scores, and then they give you a composite as a standardised score. So, despite there being big differences, you can still get the composite. That's the same if you're using TOWRY or TOMAL or any of those where a subtest gives a composite. The RIT is different. There it is. The reason I go on about the RIT so much is because assessments for verbal and non-verbal ability are largely closed to specialist assessors. There's loads of them if you're in EdPsych, but the RIT is really the only one that's open to us. And it is the only one that's approved by SASC for if you're doing DSAs for your children at university or pupils, students at university. However, for us, assessing in primary and secondary schools, we can use other assessments for verbal and non-verbal ability. So for example, BPVS or Naglieri, there's been a few that you've used, and we can get a list together if you'd like to through emailing one another, and we can build a list, that's fine. But if you're a full-time assessor, largely you're going to be using RIT, and that's why I'm going to mention it here. If you don't use the RIT, you can fast forward. Largely when you're looking at underlying ability, you don't want to flatten to deceive. So if you get subtests with large differences, you don't want to flatten it out to a composite. You want to be able to show there is a difference here between this verbal test and that verbal test, because that's giving you a lot of information. So for example, in the RIT, for the verbal ability, you've got verbal analogies and vocabulary. And if you've got your raw score, you work it out as a standard score. And if they're close, then you can get a composite score. If, however, they're very different, you don't want to. Same with the visual subtests. Well, when do you know that the gap is too great? If you look at page 76 in the RIT manual, it gives a little chart. So what you do, you think, okay, how old is my child or pupil, student? And you look down and you can see it's divided into different ages. I'm going to look at the one between 6 and 12 years of age, so we're thinking of a primary age child. And what you can do then is you look at your vocabulary and verbal analogy score, and you can think, okay, how big is the difference? So I've got vocabulary, and I look across to verbal analogies, it says 15. If the difference in your scores for your subtests is 15 or more, you can't get a composite because it's too great. So say if I was looking at diamonds and matrices, I look through from diamonds to matrices and the score's 14. That means if the difference between them is 14 or more, I can't get a composite. You'll notice there's also a row of asterisks going down. We want to use the figures above. They show that there's a 5 in 100 chance that the difference in performance happened by chance. Below, it's a 0.1 significant difference, or statistically significant difference, which means there's a 1 in 100 chance that the difference in performance happened by chance. Largely assessors are happy with 0.05, which is this area here. So whichever table you're using, look above the asterisks, that's fine. So you've let's imagine you have got a composite score for verbal and visual, and then you think to yourself, right, I want to get an overall general underlying ability score. But once again, you can get that if the difference between these two scores here, these standardised scores here, aren't too great. If it's too great, again, you would flatten to deceive, so you can't get a composite. So how do you work out whether the difference is too great? If you look on page 68 of the RIT manual, you once again have a chart. So you can look at the age of the child again down the side. We want 0.05 level of statistical significance, and then you can look across. So say if I'm testing a 13-year-old, I want 0.5 level of statistical significance, that's 13. So if the difference between my verbal and visual composite scores is 13 or above, I can't get the general IQ or general underlying ability composite. I hope that's made a little more sense for the RIT. So we'll move on now to confidence intervals. So we've discussed a little bit about the definition at session 3. So please go ahead and use the definition here. Basically, the idea is there is a margin of error in all formal testing, and the confidence interval, we like to look at it at 95%. So the 95% confidence interval gives a range of scores within which we can be 95% confident the individual's true score will fall. Sometimes they're called confidence ranges or confidence bands. It's exactly the same thing. Once again, it's just a little bit of terminology that's different. So, when would you calculate a confidence interval? Best practice is only on a composite. Composite scores are more reliable than subtest scores. So give your confidence interval for your composites. And for example, if you're using the CTOP, you would give a confidence interval for phonological awareness, but you wouldn't give it for elision and blending words and phoneme isolation, the subtests. Now, of course, on some assessments,